What's income that you don't earn? Dividends, interest, rental income, income from trust. So, interesting how things have changed. So this is just informational. It's from my tax notes publication, though, which is one that I get every week. What did Reagan do? First thing he did with this 1981 legislation is basically he created a flat tax. Bill wasn't flat, there were rates. Wait, 15%, 28%, 33%, 28%. The 33 was the elimination of the 15%. So upper middle income and wealthier taxpayers paid one tax rate, 28%. That's why some of you have talked about the flat tax. That's one version. But remember, deductions were allowed. Some versions of the flat tax, no deductions. Some of these proposals, for those, now probably not people in here so much, but some families have a lot of kids. And there's a child credit. Talking about eliminating the child credit. One proposal would increase the child credit to encourage you to have more kids. Some would eliminate the child credit. So a lot of things happening there. And flat taxes, sometimes they allow some deductions, sometimes they don't allow any. It's like I put the topic of the AMT down. What was the purpose of the AMT, the alternative minimum tax?
Is that to make sure that you're paying enough tax?
That's right. They found out that it's part of the '69 Act. They discovered that some wealthy people weren't paying taxes. Oh, what a surprise. So they said everyone should have to pay something. And that's why now your software will do this. It's Form 6251. But basically, you know, you do your income tax return, and you got your taxable income, and then you have to compute your alternative minimum taxable income, which doesn't allow state and local taxes, personal dependency exemptions, a whole lot of stuff's not allowed, miscellaneous itemized deductions. And then they compute a tax on that, and whichever tax is greater is what has to be paid. Well, the problem, and part of that they clarified in the ATRA, the fiscal cliff legislation, part of the problem is there were exclusions based on filing status that were not indexed for inflation. So every year you had to have an extender. Otherwise, 2/3 of middle income taxpayers would be paying alternative minimum tax, and they were not the target. So I believe that was made permanent in that legislation, the higher exclusions. Should we have the AMT at all? Why not just repeal it? Well, it's a big revenue producer. So that's another topic that's I put in the online discussion. Now, let's talk about the Constitution, because this is in the homework ES. Which article of the Constitution deals with the legislature? Which one deals with the legislature? Anyone know? Is Article 1, 2, or 3? I don't expect you to know this. I mean, you're not constitutional law experts. It's Article 1. So for the homework ES, there's a couple essays. Bill's real particular grading essays, because I don't like essays. I'd rather have numerical stuff. So put down, first of all, Article 1, Section 8. This, I'm sure you're very happy with Article 1, Section 8. Congress can levy taxes. Right, doesn't that make us happy? Congress can levy taxes. Article 1, Section 7. Let me start the idea and then have you finish it. All tax bills must originate in the other one, House of Representatives. All tax bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Don't write this down, but one thing that reminds me of, remember some of the attacks against the Affordable Care Act? It was said that that was a tax act, but that act started in the Senate because the Senate was Democratic control. And one of the arguments against the constitutionality was, wait, if it's a tax bill, it should have originated in the House, but originated in the Senate. They decided not to pursue that argument, but actually, it had some credibility. So Article 1, Section 7, tax bills originate in the House of Representatives. And the last one, because some of the question will say, what's the constitutionality of the income tax? Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2. Direct taxes must be apportioned. Direct taxes must be apportioned according to population. Direct taxes must be apportioned according to population. Now that actually produced a problem, because you could interpret that to mean that income taxes had to be assessed based on the population of the state. So we alleviated that with an amendment to the Constitution. Anyone know the number? I'm just curious. Which is that amendment we love that allowed for the incorporation of a federal income tax and avoid that Article 1, Section 2 problem. 16th Amendment, 1-6. So on the exam, on that one essay where they say what's the constitutional aspects of the income tax, talk about those 3 sections on Article 1 and mention the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. I used to confuse that. I used to think it was the 13th. What is the 13th Amendment? That's the one that abolished slavery. So I guess this was kind of anti-slavery. Now we're tax slaves. 16th Amendment. Being silly up here. So. Now, let's talk about how a tax bill becomes law, because they like to ask that. First, the tax bill must begin in the House Ways and Means Committee. House Ways and Means Committee. That's a committee of the House that will first talk about any tax legislation. Anyone know who the current chair is of House Ways and Means? It's got to be a Republican because they're in control of the House. It was Dave Camp from Michigan, but it's not. Who is it now? State close to us. So ahead.
Is it Paul Ryan?
Paul Ryan, excellent, yes. Paul Ryan, remember he was the vice presidential candidate with Mitt? Paul Ryan is the chair of House Ways and Means Committee. So Paul Ryan's committee will consider any proposed tax legislation. Once the bill leaves House Ways and Means, what happens to it next? When it leaves the House committee, where do you think it goes? To the House. It goes to the House of Representatives, and it's voted on by the entire House of Representatives. So it starts House Ways and Means. Once it clears the committee, it then goes to the voted on by the full House. Let's say the House passes the bill, like they just passed another Death Tax Repeal Act last week. Now we have a comparable bill that will start in Senate Finance Committee. The Senate Finance Committee will consider a similar bill. In other words, it has to deal with similar subject matter. Senate Finance Committee. Anyone know who the current chair is of Senate Finance Committee? Real conservative state he's from. Orrin Hatch. O-R-R-I-N. I spelled it wrong last term. Well, when I spelled it O-R-I-N, it didn't indicate a spelling error because I guess that was a word, but it's O-R-R-I-N. Orrin Hatch. Do you think Utah? He's a Republican senator from Utah. I think that's a conservative state, Utah? It'll be interesting to see. This is not a tax issue. When the Supreme Court considers whether same-sex marriage has to be recognized in all the states. That's got a major impact on states like South Dakota and Utah. Anyway, so Senate Finance Committee will consider a bill under similar circumstances. Once it leaves the Senate Finance Committee, where does it go? To the full Senate. goes to the full Senate for a vote. It will go to the full Senate for a vote. Now, let's go back to President Obama's first term, not this last 2 years. We had at that time a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. So would their two bills have been in agreement? Do you think those two bills would have been identical? No way. No way. So what we established then, because the bills from the House and Senate will probably be different, we set up a joint committee of the House and Senate. So a joint committee, that's next step, of the House and Senate will reconsider the two separate bills, and what's their goal? To arrive at a compromise. So the joint committee of the House and Senate will try to reconcile the two separate bills and create a compromise. Now you say, well, that won't be necessary now because Republicans had the House and Senate. It still will be, because some senators, for example, are more moderate, and some House members. I mean, so it's not like everything's just going to be rubber stamped. So they come out with a joint committee comes up with a bill that is then passed by the House and Senate. What can happen next? Well, okay, well, the president could sign it, and then everyone's happy. But as you're pointing out, it's more likely now the president will veto the bill. The president will probably veto the bill, especially now with President Obama. And if the bill is vetoed, it can be overridden. It can be overridden by and I had to look this up because I wasn't sure. 2/3, I wasn't sure. By a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate. So it can be the veto can be overridden by a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate. Now, one thing that's interesting is in the Senate, if it went strictly by a party vote, Republicans don't have that big a majority. So they'd have to get some Democratic votes. So there may be presidential vetoes that are not overridden, even under the current situation. Now, if we have one party in control of both bodies of Congress and the presidency, then probably there won't be vetoes. So a number of issues that arise there. So remember that this is part of an essay on the Homework ES Week 3. Also in the Homework ES Week 3, and I wouldn't have known this without guidance, they ask in all three versions, there's three versions of the quiz. What is the common body, better write this down, what is the common body of tax law? The common body of tax law, which they abbreviate CBOTL. I agree with their answer, but if you just gave me that off the top of your head, I wouldn't know what you were talking about. Four components, and they do make sense. Constitutional, these are the four components of the CBOTL. Constitutional, comma, legislative, comma, administrative, and judicial authorities. Bill, please repeat, I will. Constitutional, let's think about that. We've already seen how we have a constitutional amendment, and we know basically that tax laws, for example, we'll talk in a few minutes about what the IRS does. The IRS interprets the law. If their interpretation goes too far, it's going to violate the Constitution because they will be legislating, and IRS can only interpret. Legislative. The Internal Revenue Code that is so maligned, you know, the people in Congress are always maligning it. But it's their document. They're the ones who passed the law. And why is the Internal Revenue Code so thick? Because every time there's a tax bill, there's all these special interests that lobby the Congress people to get special provisions. That makes it real elaborate. Administrative, who's the administrative agency that administers the tax laws? Who's our friend? IRS. Internal Revenue people. And judicial authorities. Judicial authorities because the courts can rule on tax cases. So on the exam, homework ES, which is a quiz to me, they ask for what's the CBOTL, just put down constitutional, legislative, administrative, and judicial authorities. Now there's another part, this is all part of one essay. Woo! There's only 2 essays though, the other essay is real short. Talk about it next week. Now let's come over here, and they're asking what does the IRS do? But first of all, let's look at this part of Bill's board.